She walked into school wearing her father's old army jacket. Sun-faded, too big, smelling of memory. By second period, they were mocking her. By lunch, a video of her went viral. They laughed, pointed, called her names like Private Zoe and Operation Desperate. What they didn't know? That jacket belonged to a Medal of Honor hero her father killed while saving 12 men in Afghanistan. And on the anniversary of his death, she wore it to remember. Then the sky roared open, and a Black Hawk landed on the football field. You're not ready for what happens next. Subscribe now and witness a story you'll never forget. The school bus hissed to a halt, its doors folding open with a groan. Zoe Chun stepped down onto the cracked pavement of Lincoln High's front loop, the soles of her combat boots hitting concrete with a deliberate rhythm. 1 step, 2, 3. Her father's camouflage jacket hung loose on her frame, sleeves rolled at the wrists, the fabric sun-faded and soft from years of wear. The scent of old cologne still clung to it, a whisper of him she refused to wash away. It was Spirit Week, Homecoming Week, and today's theme was Decades Day. Students spilled across the front lawn in a mashup of thrift store disco shirts, flannel 90s grunge, and ironic bell-bottoms. Glitter, denim, neon. The whole scene was a time capsule cracked open and spilled onto asphalt. And in the middle of it, Zoe looked like she'd come from another world entirely, or a war zone. She made it 6 steps before the whispers started. Is she serious? Oh my God, is this a joke? Someone forgot it's not Halloween. Laughter rose in soft pockets, floating behind her like smoke. Phones lifted, angled, screens tilted just enough to catch her full-frame boots to dog tags. She didn't flinch, didn't slow down. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on the double doors ahead, though her fingers curled tighter in the sleeves. The knot in her throat pressed higher. From behind a silver SUV, Madison Torres stepped into view, a glittered headband holding back her salon blonde hair, a tie-dye shirt knotted at the waist, and a smirk already cocked in place. "Camo for homecoming?" Madison said loudly, loud enough to carry. Someone's trying really hard to win, most likely to invade lunch period. Laughter erupted. Quick, harsh, designed to pierce. Zoe said nothing. She walked past them all like she was walking through smoke. But every stare, every snap of a phone camera clung to her like ash. She felt the weight of every eye, every assumption, every cheap joke passed between giggles. All she wanted was to slip through the day unnoticed. But grief had its own kind of uniform. And on October 15th, she wore it like armor because remembering was the only way to survive forgetting. Zoe had only been at Lincoln High for 8 weeks, but it felt longer, like she'd aged a year for every hallway she'd walked without speaking. The school was a closed ecosystem, the kind that formed early and calcified fast. Cliques moved like weather patterns, predictable, territorial, unforgiving. Everyone knew where to sit, how to dress, what not to say. Zoe hadn't been invited to any of it. She transferred in the second week of senior year, the kind of late entry that made her a permanent outsider. Her mom had married Roberta Kind, steady man with insurance spreadsheets for hobby sand, moved them 3 counties south. The boxes hadn't even been fully unpacked before Zoe's name appeared on a class roster she didn't ask to join. She never complained. There was no point. Her old school held too many shadows. Staying had meant walking past the field where the VFW still flew a flag at half-mast. The town had buried her father there. Her mother buried everything else. So Zoe started over. Again. At Lincoln High, she kept to herself. Eyes down, voices low. Nothing to draw attention. Her notebooks were neat. Her answers quiet but correct. She ate lunch alone, usually under the oak tree by the east parking lot, where no one cared enough to interrupt. People didn't speak to her so much as around her. New girl. Quiet one. Kinda weird. One of the theater boys once guessed she was homeschooled before this, because she has that staring into space look. Another said she looked like she was always waiting for something to go wrong. Still, they left her alone. Mostly. Until today. The camouflage turned a low hum of curiosity into open derision. She'd crossed an invisible line, stepped outside the comfort zone of passive non-existence, and walked into something visible, something unsettling. Now the whole school had questions she hadn't offered to answer. Who wears that to school? What is she trying to prove? Is she broken, or just desperate? Zoe knew better than to think she could explain. Grief didn't translate well to teenage social codes. Her father's death didn't come with a dress code they understood. All they saw was a girl in combat boots, walking through a battlefield they mistook for a hallway. By second period, the novelty of Zoe's uniform had become sport. It started with whispers, the kind traded in huddled corners and over Snapchats sent under desks. But Lincoln High didn't do quiet for long, not when there was entertainment to be mined from someone else's discomfort. Especially not when that someone had already been marked as strange. The weird new girl had delivered herself to them wrapped in camouflage and silence, and now the court of public opinion demanded spectacle. In the hallway between history and lit, a trio of football players staged an impromptu parade behind her. Jake Morrison barked fake orders with a swagger that made his cleats squeak against the linoleum. Left, right, left, right. He hollered in his best cartoon sergeant voice, while his teammates goose-stepped in unison, giving exaggerated salutes that sent nearby students into fits of laughter. Stand aside, civilians, we've got a live one. Someone filmed it. Someone always did. By lunch, the video had circulated through every group chat worth belonging to. It was playing on phones in locker bays and whispered about at lunch tables, captioned with hashtags like Private Zoe and Operation Desperate. It wasn't just mockery, it was social currency. In Drama Hall, the theater kids turned their own version into a comedy skit. They ducked behind lockers, shouting, "Incoming," as Zoe walked past. One even mimicked a grenade toss, then threw himself to the floor in exaggerated agony. Another added a soundtrack on his Bluetooth speaker, action movie gunfire, layered under a patriotic soundtrack. A few teachers raised eyebrows but said nothing. No one wanted to be the one to ruin the joke. Zoe didn't respond. She kept her expression locked down, her gaze fixed forward, her body still. But each laugh, each look, each performance carved something hollow behind her ribs. At her locker, the final insult waited. A sticky note taped dead center on the blue metal. Black Sharpie, thick and scrawled. G.I. Jane called. She wants her trauma back. She stared at it for a full 10 seconds. No one spoke, but people were watching. Zoe peeled it off with steady hands, folded it once, then tucked it into the pocket of her father's jacket, not to keep it, not really, just because it was easier than crying in front of strangers. The bathroom stall was silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional burst of laughter echoing in from the hallway. Zoe sat on the closed lid of the toilet, her knees drawn to her chest, one hand buried in the deep front pocket of her father's jacket. Her fingers curled tightly around the cool, familiar metal of the dog tags that never left her side. The edges pressed into her palm like punctuation marks on a sentence she hadn't yet figured out how to speak. The laughter outside felt distant and unreal. It belonged to another world, one she had never quite been able to rejoin. 3 years ago, the world had split. It was a Thursday. The leaves outside their old house had just started to turn brittle and red. Zoe remembered because she had been standing barefoot in the hallway, half listening to her mom call her down for dinner, when the knock came. 2 of them, a woman and a man, both in army dress blues. The woman spoke first. She had a voice like gravel smoothed over by years of discipline. "Are you Mrs. Chun?" she'd asked. And Zoe remembered how her mother's hand trembled on the doorframe as she answered. What came next blurred into flashes, the creak of the living room floor, the sharp intake of breath. The words, "killed in action," and "outside Kandahar," and "saved 12 others." The sound of her mother collapsing to her knees, the quiet sob Zoe didn't know had come from her own throat. Staff Sergeant David Chun. Father. Soldier. Communications specialist. Gone. Zoe hadn't worn the uniform since his funeral. That day, it had swallowed her. The sleeves dangled past her fingertips. The hem of the jacket brushed her shins. She'd barely grown into it, but she'd never grown out of the ache it held. Today wasn't about shock value. It wasn't about school spirit or irony or trying to make a point. It was about holding something real, something steady, about standing in the only skin that still felt close to his. She pressed the tags to her lips, the way she had that night when the flag was folded and handed to her mother, and then later to her. The weight hadn't changed. He had died on October 15th, and every year since, Zoe wore his name like armor. The hum of the Bunsen burners and the scratch of chalk on whiteboard usually made chemistry feel like a safe zone. Numbers, formulas, fixed reactions that didn't require interpretation. Unlike people. Unlike high school, Zoe had come to rely on the order of it, the predictability. But today, even that quiet refuge didn't hold. She sat in the back corner, same as always, her notebook open to a blank page. She hadn't written anything yet. Mrs. Patterson was at the front, explaining covalent bonds with her usual quiet enthusiasm, drawing overlapping circles with a green expo marker. Around Zoe, the classroom rustled with the soft sounds of note-taking and whispered commentary. But there was an undercurrent, something buzzing just beneath the surface. Tyler Brooks was watching her. She could feel it like static electricity, the way his gaze lingered too long, the way he whispered something to the guy next to him and smirked. He stood abruptly, holding up a dull pencil. "Need to sharpen this," he announced, too loud for the task. Mrs. Patterson nodded without looking. He didn't head toward the sharpener directly. Instead, he took the long route behind Zoe's desk. She knew it was coming. With a deliberate sweep of his arm, he tripped and knocked her books, her pencil case, and her water bottle to the floor. Papers scattered. A pencil rolled under the lab table. "Whoa, we got a code red in here," he shouted. Man down, man down." He dropped into a crouch, hands flaring like he was bracing for impact. Boom, kaboom, incoming mortar fire. The classroom erupted. Laughter rippled in waves. Desks shook with the effort of stifled giggles. Some students clapped. One actually made machine gun noises. Mrs. Patterson, absorbed in her lecture, didn't turn around. Zoe knelt to gather her things. The sleeves of her father's jacket brushed the tile as she reached under her chair, her hands moving with practiced calm. Her heart wasn't racing, it wasn't even surprised. She knew this dance. She had lived in its rhythm. Tyler leaned down too, voice low. "Careful, soldier. Wouldn't want you to drop a grenade under the periodic table." More laughter. More whispers. Zoe straightened, her face unreadable, her movements precise. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just sat back in her chair and flipped to the next blank page in her notebook. Silence wasn't surrender. It was her armor. The cafeteria buzzed with the chaos unique to high school lunch, plastic trays clattering, soda cans hissing open, voices ricocheting off linoleum and brick. Zoe moved through the line quietly, her tray barely weighted down with food she wouldn't eat. Every step through the lunchroom felt like walking through a minefield. Conversations paused as she passed. Eyes followed her like spotlights. The camouflage didn't blend here. It made her glow like a warning. She took a seat at the farthest table from the center, her back to the wall, the way her father used to sit in diners when he was home. Strategic, watchful, alone. For a few minutes, it was quiet. Then came the click of manicured nails on a phone case, the scent of too sweet perfume, the unmistakable sound of heels that didn't belong in a high school. Madison Torres approached like she owned the room, because most days she did. Brittany Walsh and Chloe Martinez flanked her, an entourage of polished smiles and carefully curated cruelty. They slid into the seats around Zoe like gravity had summoned them there. "Hey," Madison said brightly, too brightly. "Just wanted to check in. You know, make sure this outfit," she gestured vaguely at Zoe's uniform, Isn't some kind of cry for help? Brittany giggled, the kind that sounded like glass cracking. Costume day isn't until Friday. Chloe tilted her head, lips pursed in fake concern. Like, are you doing okay? Because this whole look is kind of intense. Zoe didn't answer. She picked at the corner of her sandwich, hands steady, face unreadable. Silence again. We could take you shopping, Madison offered, her tone faux generous. Get you something that doesn't look like it came from a surplus bin. Zoe stood slowly. Her chair scraped across the floor with a sound that made half the cafeteria glance over. She looked Madison straight in the eyes. You have no idea what you're talking about, she said, voice low but razor sharp. Madison blinked, thrown for a beat, but recovered with a smirk. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. Oh, please, she said, voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. What are you going to do? Call your daddy to come save you. The room stilled. Zoe didn't flinch, but her breath caught, just slightly. The silence stretched long and tight, and somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. Something cracked, but not in the way Madison had hoped. It started as a low, unfamiliar rumble barely noticeable beneath the cafeteria's usual din. Trays clattered. Students laughed and shouted over one another. Someone dropped a bottle of Snapple, and it rolled toward the vending machines. The noise seemed like nothing at first. Background. Distant. Unimportant. Then the windows began to shake. It was subtle at first. A quiet rattle in the frames, a shimmer in the glass. Then the light shifted suddenly, unnaturally, like a shadow had passed over the entire building. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The hum deepened into a full-bodied roar, the kind you felt in your chest before your ears could register it. Some students ducked instinctively. Others jumped up, craning their necks to see out the long east-facing windows. Phones were out within seconds. Screens tilted, recording. Voices rose in a chorus of confusion and half-formed questions. What is that? Is it an earthquake? Holy crap, is that a? And then it came into view. Through the cafeteria windows, over the tree line and just above the football field, a massive Black Hawk helicopter descended from the sky like some impossible specter pulled from a war film. Its rotors tore the air with violent precision, kicking up waves of dust and scattering loose papers in the courtyard below. The ground trembled. Lunch trays vibrated on tables. Students pressed their faces to the glass, mouths open, eyes wide. A teacher shouted for everyone to stay calm. No one listened. Zoe remained still. Her heart stopped, then surged so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She knew that aircraft, knew the markings along the tail boom, the white stenciled numbers on the side. Her breath caught as the insignia came into VA, a unit crest she'd memorized when she was 10, tracing it on patches and dog tags. She stood slowly, her tray forgotten. Around her, students swarmed the windows, pushing for a better view. Phones filming, voices rising. But Zoe only watched. The aircraft hovered, then lowered, the landing gear kissing the 50-yard line in one practiced, unshakable motion. The side doors opened. And from inside, dressed in full-service uniform, stepped Colonel Sarah Mitchell. Zoe's hands trembled. She hadn't seen that woman since the day her world came undone. The intercom crackled to life, just as the cafeteria was reaching full panic. Students were shouting, pushing toward the exits, phones raised like periscopes, capturing the unfolding chaos on the field. Teachers tried to corral the frenzy, their voices drowned by the still thundering helicopter rotors outside. Then, cutting through the noise like a blade, "Attention students and faculty," Principal Williams said, his voice unsteady, uncharacteristically clipped. "Zoe Chun, please report to the main office immediately. I repeat, Zoe Chun to the main office." Silence hit like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Every whisper stopped. Even the helicopter seemed to fade for a beat beneath the weight of those words. Zoe stood frozen at the edge of the cafeteria, the hum of fluorescent lights replaced by a deeper, heavier stillness. Her heart hammered behind her ribs, not with fear but with something deeper, older recognition. And then the doors opened. Two uniformed officers, navy dress blues, medals gleaming, posture rigid, stepped inside. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. One nodded to Zoe with crisp precision. The other extended an arm. Not an invitation, but an escort. The crowd parted as if by instinct. She walked forward. The boots that had drawn so much laughter now hit the linoleum like a drum beat, steady, final, measured. Phones were still raised, but no one was laughing now. The same hallway where she had been trailed by fake salutes and whispered jokes was silent. Students lined the lockers like statues. Tyler Brooks stood by the vending machines, pale, eyes wide, the word "oops" still hanging somewhere behind his lips. Madison was near the stairwell, mouth slightly open, a hand halfway to her phone but frozen mid-air. No one spoke. No one dared. Zoe walked past them all, her head high, her eyes forward. Between the two officers, she was no longer the weird new girl in camo. No longer the girl mocked for wearing her grief like a second skin. She was something else now. Not invisible. Not a joke. A daughter of a fallen soldier. And for the first time that day, she wasn't walking alone. The field was silent. The entire school, students, teachers, administrators, even the lunch staff stood in a wide semicircle around the 50-yard line, eyes fixed on the Black Hawk and the figures beside it. The wind stirred slowly now, the worst of the rotor wash fading. Zoe stood next to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the sun catching on the medals across the woman's chest, a lifetime of service etched into the set of her shoulders. Principal Williams hovered to the side, his usual composure unraveling beneath the weight of the moment. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward to the microphone. The wind caught the edge of her cap as she spoke. "Students and faculty of Lincoln High," she began, her voice firm and clear. 3 years ago today, Staff Sergeant David Chun made the ultimate sacrifice for his country while serving in Afghanistan. Zoe's hands clenched around the fabric of her father's jacket. The words hit her like waves, familiar, yes, but never easier to hear. He died while protecting 12 members of his unit after their convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar, the colonel continued. He left the safety of his vehicle to establish a communication link that allowed for air support and evacuation. He was killed by sniper fire before rescue could arrive. But because of him, 12 soldiers lived to go home. The crowd didn't move, not a shuffle, not a murmur. Even the students who always rolled their eyes at assembly speeches were still transfixed. "For his extraordinary courage," the colonel said, opening a walnut case held by one of the junior officers behind her, Staff Sergeant Chun was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Not the dramatic kind, the real kind, involuntary kind that happens when something shifts your world by degrees. Mitchell turned to Zoe, who stood motionless, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "This," the colonel said softly, lifting a folded American flag from another case, "was flown over the forward operating base where your father served. It was lowered to half staff the day he died, and it has waited just like you for this moment." She placed it in Zoe's arms. The weight of the fabric was heavier than expected, and yet somehow grounding. Zoe looked down at it, then at the medal now pinned to the jacket she wore. His jacket. For the first time since he left, she felt him standing beside her. And now so did everyone else. The crowd didn't move even after the colonel stepped back from the microphone. The silence held thick, reverent, alive with the weight of things unspoken. Zoe stood in the center of it all, her father's flag cradled in her arms, the Medal of Honor now pinned to the very jacket he used to wear on early Sunday mornings to make pancakes. It shimmered in the late afternoon light, catching the sun like a flame caught in metal. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The field had become a sanctuary. Tyler Brooks was the first to approach her, The same boy who had knocked over her textbooks, who had joked about grenades and airstrikes, now looked like he'd aged years in the span of an hour. His face was pale, eyes red-rimmed. He took 2 cautious steps forward, hands shaking slightly at his sides. "I didn't know," he said, voice barely more than breath. "Zoe, I'm so sorry. About your dad. About everything." She looked at him for a long time. Not with anger, not even pity, just clarity. "You didn't ask," she said quietly. Tyler swallowed hard, like the words stung, because they did. Madison was next. Her perfect makeup had lost its edge, her highlighter smudged where her fingers had touched her cheeks. She stood awkwardly in front of Zoe, flanked no longer by Brittany and Chloe but by her own embarrassment. "I said things I shouldn't have," Madison offered, the bravado gone. "We all did. I didn't understand. Zoe held up a hand. "You didn't want to." The words landed with surgical precision, not cruel, just honest. Madison nodded once, then turned away, tears streaking through the last layers of mascara. The helicopter's engines began to stir again, the blades cutting through the thick afternoon air. Zoe turned to watch it lift, the flag pressed tight to her chest. Dust swirled around her, hair whipped by the rising wind, but she stood steady. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She just watched it disappear into the sky that had taken so much from her, and somehow, in return, left her something too. She walked back toward the school, the same hallways that had once swallowed her now clearing before her. Not to disappear, not to hide, but to be seen exactly as she was. A daughter, a soldier's legacy, a girl in camo, standing taller than ever.